During some of my shipwreck videos, I've touched on the Kure bombing raids, what is often called the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, considering that Navy had been a spent force long before the raids. Nonetheless, those strikes by American carriers did seal the coffin, as it were. The remnants of Japan's capital ships were destroyed, from battleships to aircraft carriers and down on to cruisers, sunk in shallow water and in several cases bombed further after their sinking. None of the major combatants escaped damage, and only a couple, such as Nagato or Katsuragi, were even remotely functional by the end. For this weekend, we'll be doing a double feature on this topic. Today we'll look at the background, the raids themselves, and the immediate aftermath. Tomorrow will be a compilation video of the various Kure wrecks that I've covered before. Not the usual sort of format, to be fair, but I feel this works better than cramming the topics together. Namely because both of these videos are already on the longer side. With that said, let's get into things, starting with, of course, the background. The first and most important thing to note in that regard is how things got to this point. Over the course of the war, the Japanese fleet remained a major threat, from Pearl Harbor to the East Indies and the Solomons. It was really only in late 1944 that they were finally pushed back completely, with Leyte Gulf gutting the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the lack of fuel in 1945 sealed the deal. The Japanese sourced most of their fuel from the captured fields in the East Indies, and while they retained control of those oil fields, the loss of the Philippines and the American submarine offensive made transporting that impossible. Barely enough made it to Japan to keep the industry running, and most of the surplus was earmarked for aircraft and not ships. As a result, by the spring of 1945, the Japanese fleet was largely confined to port, either distant bases like Singapore or locations in the home islands such as Kure. Even so, the remaining ships couldn't exactly be ignored, not least because there was still a very real possibility that Japan would have to be invaded to force a surrender. Even ships with limited fuel could, hypothetically, make an attempt to contest a landing, or even a more distant operation, such as the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945, as would actually happen with Operation 10 Go. With this in mind, it should be little surprise that the surviving Japanese warships were a prime target, even if the first raid on Kure focused more on air bases, with the warships a more secondary target. That's less surprising than it sounds, because that first air raid came on March 18, 1945. Not as a direct attack on the Japanese fleet, but as raids on airfields, to cripple Japanese air power in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa. It was only the following day, March 19th, when the focus shifted to naval targets, and even then, the initial objective was infrastructure, fuel tanks, and other such things. It was only relatively late in the game that the attack shifted to the warships, most notably in this case, 4 battleships and 4 aircraft carriers. These being Haruna, Yamato, Hyuga, and Ise for the battleships, or battle carriers in the case of the second pair. For the carriers, the targets were Ryuho, Katsuragi, Kaio, and Amagi. Various lighter targets were also hit, such as the light cruiser Oyoto. I've covered all the ships listed here aside from Kaio and Yamato. If you're interested in more detail on their specific stories, I can link the videos in the description. For this video, the important thing to note is this. Despite throwing some 300 aircraft at the problem between fighters and bombers, the damage was relatively minimal. Ryuho, Kaio, and Oyoto suffered the worst. The light carrier was hit by 3 bombs and 2 rockets, which took her out of the war. The Japanese lacked the resources or motivation to properly repair her, not when the flight deck was ruined and the power plant damaged. Oyoto, meanwhile, was crippled by several bomb hits. These wrecked her power plant and caused such severe flooding that she had to be beached. The cruiser would remain in that position, run aground in shallow water, until March 23rd. I'd argue that Oyoto suffered the worst here, though you'll see Kaio claim to be the worst hit. She took 1 bomb that caused severe fires and flooding. Between this damage and developing a notable list, the carrier was beached to be safe. Within a month, however, the ship was sailing around again. The fact that none of these outright sank, and even Oyoto returned to limited service, speaks to how minor the damage was. The capital ships escaped with even less damage. Hyuga was hit by 1 bomb, which didn't do much. Issei was hit by 2, but again the ship was largely undamaged. The same went for Haruna and Yamato, which each suffered 1 bomb hit, and each were basically undamaged by those bombs. Amagi and Katsuragi were more or less the same. A single bomb hit and a near miss to Katsuragi that did minimal damage. This speaks to how difficult it actually was to damage ships in harbor, even stationary ships, as we'll see later in the video. However, that does come later. The next attack on a major Japanese ship didn't come until July 18th, 1945. That came at Yokosuka, where the battleship Nagato was moored more or less alone. She would be attacked by American aircraft and hit by 2 bombs. A 500-pound, 230-kilogram weapon that struck the bridge, and another 500-pounder that hit the deck and did little damage, beyond blowing a hole over the officers' lounge, leading to the loss of 21 men, while the bridge hit, for its part, killed 13. Worse damage came to a minesweeper alongside, which was blown in too. A shockingly light damage tally for 270 tons of bombs. The only actual warships sunk were the antique armored cruiser Kasuga, an incomplete destroyer, and a single submarine. Regardless, Nagato escaped with little real damage. The Japanese even went so far as flooding some of her ballast tanks to make the damage look worse than it actually was. That might have protected her from the kind of attack that hit Kure about a week later. Those raids on July 24th and 28th are what really sealed the fate of the Japanese Navy. Even if the actual commander on the metaphorical ground, one Admiral John McCain Sr., disputed the necessity of the attacks. McCain and his staff viewed the mission as a waste of resources, and a dangerous waste at that. The March attack had seen Franklin crippled and Wasp heavily damaged. Why risk a repeat performance for some worn-out ships out of fuel? Things did go over his head here. Admiral Halsey, in overall command of 3rd Fleet, had direct orders from Admiral Nimitz. Destroy what remained of the Japanese fleet. As much revenge for Pearl Harbor as a strategic move. regardless of any justification, like preventing the ships from engaging the Soviets or the Japanese using their fleet as a bargaining chip. As such, the attacks would go in, even though Kure was a tough target, with the Japanese, after the attack in March, heavily reinforcing the anchorage. The hills surrounding it were riddled with anti-aircraft guns, and the warships were scattered about so they couldn't be attacked together, in addition to being moored near the high hills, making them difficult targets to hit. While the fleet carriers, Amagi and Katsuragi, had fake towns built on their decks to camouflage them. However, the worst part was arguably the depth of the harbor, for two main reasons. First, even if a ship were sunk, it wouldn't have very far to go. We'll be seeing that in detail in tomorrow's video. And secondly, much like Pearl Harbor, it made torpedoes very difficult to use. Bombs and rockets would have to suffice. Now, with all of that covered, let's look at the attacks themselves. The first of these went in on July 24th, 1945. 15 American carriers, split between 9 Essex-class and 6 Independence-class, attacked Kure. Between those ships, that was 1,200 aircraft. Nothing puts into perspective just how powerful the fast carriers were than numbers like that. Those aircraft would launch just under 1,400 sorties against Kure on July 24th. The Japanese made little effort to contest this, holding their aircraft back for the predicted invasion of the home islands. That left the fleet at Kure with only anti-aircraft guns for defense. Unsurprisingly, against such an overwhelming attack, this was nowhere near enough. American aircraft would drop 599 tons of bombs and fire 1,600 rockets at both the ships and targets ashore, such as locomotives and fuel tanks. Despite this, the main target remained the Japanese warships. 22 were sunk or badly damaged, 258,000 tons of shipping, with another 53 smaller ships of various types sunk in neighboring bases. Of the warships, the notable casualties were the big vessels. The carrier Amagi was heavily damaged, with her flight deck blown apart by a 2,000-pound bomb, in addition to near misses that caused a severe list. A premature order to abandon ship almost saw her sink, but quick repairs kept the ship afloat. While her sister, Katsuragi, largely escaped damage. She was better concealed and only took one 500-pound bomb. As for the battleships, Issei and Hyuga were both severely damaged. Issei was attacked by over 60 aircraft. 5 direct hits and numerous near misses left her a wreck. A wreck that was technically afloat, but only just. Hyuga suffered worse. She was hit by 10 direct hits and 30 near misses that left her a flaming wreck, slowly settling on the shallow bottom. Issei lost 50 crew. Hyuga lost 200, with a further 600 wounded. That just left Haruna, the oldest of the capital ships. She would continue to avoid major damage, only taking 1 hit to her stern. Unfortunately, that hit opened up a large gash that left her very vulnerable to flooding. Moving on, it wasn't just capital ships hit here. 2 heavy cruisers, Tone and Aoba, were also hit. Tone took 4 direct hits and 7 near misses, forcing the crew to beach her. Aoba only took 1 direct hit and 1 near miss, but the damage below the waterline saw her settle on the bottom. Oyoto would suffer worse once more. She was hit by 5 bombs, setting a fire that burned for 2 days. She remained afloat, but was otherwise a wreck, with the first day of strikes rounded off by 2 antique warships being sunk. The old battleship Setsu grounded in shallow water, and the even older armored cruiser Iwate had her hull opened up and sank. After this, the Japanese had 4 days to recover. The second wave of strikes wouldn't come until July 28th. Those would finish what the first day had started, for the most part. For example, the crippled Amagi was hit by another bomb. Several near misses contributed more damage, sending her to the bottom with a 70-degree list. She was, in the end, the last Japanese carrier sunk in the war. Meanwhile, Katsuragi took 2 direct hits. Those ruined the flight deck, but the carrier remained afloat and mostly functional. She would be the only complete Japanese fleet carrier to survive the war. Much more damage came to Ise, Hyuga, and Haruna. Ise was hit by 3 different waves, 15 direct hits, and numerous near misses. The ship settled completely on the bottom at this point, much like her sister Hyuga, which was already sunk. Despite this, she was hit once more. The battleship was blasted into the bottom and left a ruin. As for Haruna, she took 13 direct hits and at least 10 near misses. This caused her to develop a list which opened that gash to the water. The veteran ship was finally out of the war and would remain on the bottom until scrapped post-war. The cruisers, Aoba, Oyoto, and Tone, were all hit as well. All 3 ships were destroyed by this to varying degrees. Tone was the most intact. Aoba had her stern blown off, and Oyoto capsized onto her side, while the last victims of this attack were the antique cruiser Izumo and the new destroyer Nashi. This rounds off the end of the Japanese Navy. Between the 2 raids, the American aircraft flew 3,620 sorties. They dropped 1,389 tons of bombs, fired 4,827 rockets, and claimed around 270 Japanese aircraft. As for the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was destroyed as a fighting force. Only 5 damaged carriers remained afloat, and of the battleships, only Nagato was left, with 2 crippled heavy cruisers at Singapore to potentially back her up, as well as only 2 light cruisers. The Japanese fleet, the menace of the Pacific, came to an end as a functional force. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.